the Deputy Director of the French Institute in Israel. Welcome to our webinar. We'll wait for a few seconds in order to let everyone going in the room. People are loading. So I'm very pleased to see so many of you, more than 50% already connected to our webinar. Tonight, we'll have the pleasure to discuss a very interesting topic about urban policy and sociology in Israel, about mixed cities. I leave the floor in a few seconds to our two distinguished panelists. First, Daniel Monterescu will speak. He's a professor at the Central European University, and he published several books about especially the city of Jaffa. And he will speak and discuss tonight with Yoann Morvan, a French researcher from the CNRS, currently working at the French Research Center in Jerusalem, which is a research center based in Israel. And he's more specifically working and studying about the city of Lod. So the two will have kind of mirror presentation about those two very specific interesting cities. Just a word about how how the seminar will go on. The two will have the two presentations in a row, and then so after the 20-30 minutes presentations, we'll have a room for Q&A. I ask you to use the Q&A option in order to leave your questions. Please do not use the chat because it will make easier for the two panelists to answer your questions. So please press the Q&A button and publish your questions. Which the two panelists will answer at the end of the presentation. So now it's my pleasure to leave the floor to Daniel. We'll start his presentation about Jaffa. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us tonight. And I wish everyone a very good webinar. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you. I thank the Institut Français Israël for organizing the event. We will start as a kind of a duo, Yoann and myself, to talk about the different facets of what some people call coexistence, or what others people call living with the other. Right? So the general question beyond the political concerns of the Israeli and the Palestinian case is what does it mean to live together? Right? Is it, like Sartre said, the hell on earth embodied in the other, or is it a form of emancipation or even redemption sometimes? So greetings from Marseille, where I'm now based this year, and we can later talk about the similarities and differences between Jaffa and Marseille, both multicultural cities, port cities, and cities that are central, sometimes in a negative way, to the construction of the project of the nation. So I will start with my presentation today in many ways in the end, right? What kind of discourses, I would like to ask, what kinds of futures are imagined in this specific ethnically mixed city of Jaffa, right? Jaffa, which is historically the mother of Tel Aviv, but also in many ways it's a forgotten child. This is an image from 2011, from the glorious days of the Arab Spring and the social housing and the housing protest in Jaffa. And what we see here in this interesting slogan, Zchut HaShiva LeYafo Atika, or the right of return to old Jaffa, is precisely this connection between a political discourse of rights, the right of return, and an urban discourse of rights, right? So it's not the right of return to Palestine or to Israel, but it's really a right of return to the old city that symbolizes some form of a social existence that perhaps is no more. Because as you know, the old city of Jaffa is now rented and appropriated by so-called artists and exclusively them, right? What makes this slogan also interesting is that it was a Jewish activist who actually formulated it, but it was mainly used by Palestinian demonstrators. So you have here the whole connection, the whole network between Jewish and Palestinian activists in Jaffa. The question of living together, the question of coexistence, is for me also a poetic question. So it's not just a political questions about control and about domination and about sovereignty, but it's also about how to capture moments of beauty and moments of despair. So let's start with the Mahmoud Darwish poem, State of Siege, which is based, of course, on his own, his own experience. He writes, "Me or him, thus begins the war, but it ends with an awkward encounter," right? Liqa haraj in Arabic, an awkward encounter, me and him. So a war which starts often with the ultimate separation sometimes creates the opposite, creates a certain form of encounter. And I think this is what we can be generalized about the history of ethnically mixed cities in Israel, that we have this tension, this dance between social distance and intimacy that define what sociologists call the sociality of the city. Another poet of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is Edward Said, who writes about our history as a form of a very rich, but also very tragic, in many ways desperate history of extremes, opposites in the Hegelian sense, right? So this is, Said invites us to talk about the Palestinian and the Jew, not separately, but as part of a symphony. And he says there's something magnificently imposing about it, right? There's some kind of sublime grandeur, a series of tragedies, of losses, of sacrifices, of pain, right? And in many ways, for someone who lives in ethnically mixed cities like Jaffa and Haifa and Ramle and Lyd, the question is precisely to try to see how things are connected, okay? So my presentation today will be a very brief exposition of my work, which has been going on for many years now. This is my first book, Jaffa Shared and Shattered, Contrived Coexistence in Israel-Palestine, which is about the spatial, the history of urban space, which was followed by my second book on life stories of elderly citizens in Jaffa who look back at 70 years of living together, of sharing the city. So I'll try to synthesize what my insights are about Jaffa along three axes that we'll talk about in a minute. But let me just give you a few vignettes, a few elements that shows the complexity of living together in Jaffa. So this is the truth, the reality we see on the walls, right? On the right-hand side, a street name after an Etzel militant who died during the 1948 war. He was a sportsman, and he received under Roni Milot's mayorship a street. As a form of response, the Islamic movement posted a sign which says in Arabic, "Istaghfiru rabbakum innahu kana ghafaram," beg mercy or beg pardon from God because he is merciful. So we see in Jaffa not only the negotiation or the conflict between people, but also between materials, right? And between movements that are kind of inscribed on the wall. Another example is this statement by a Palestinian man and a Jewish woman who confessed their affair, their love story, and they did it in Jabaliyah in a recently renovated mosque. Now you can imagine, of course, the outrage, and the graffiti was erased the day after, and it left kind of very nice 3 signs, white signs, instead of Fuad, love, and Osnat. But this invites us to try to understand what happens to mixed couples, right? What happens to people who individually embody a form of transgression, a form of danger, right? The same is also true for the bilingual schools, the Yad V'Yad schools. One of them was a victim of an arson attack in Jerusalem. And the sign that the perpetrator left behind was, there is no coexistence with cancer. So the question is, what is cancer? Are Arabs and Jews living together cancer? Is this possible? Is it a disease that needs to be fixed? Another graffiti is this one that I, next to the big post office in Sderot Yerushalayim, which is very ambiguous, right? If we were sitting in a room, I would ask you, what do you make of it? What do you think? Why is it so ambiguous? But we're not there, so, and we need to be short, so let me tell you what I think it's ambiguous and what other people told me it's ambiguous. First, because it's in English, in a space that rarely speaks English, right? And then it's not about Yafo, like the Hebrew word, or Jaffa, the English word, or even Yafa, the Arabic word, but it's Jaffo, it's kind of a hybrid. And then is there exactly, there is also the swastika in the Star of David, which is incomprehensible, but the question of what exactly did they mean, right? Is it a statement of inclusion? Is it a statement of exclusion? Jaffo is the Jewish city too, right? So is it also the city of non-Jews? Is it also the cities of Arabs and Palestinians? It's not clear. What is definitely clear is when I came back 2 years later to check on the graffiti, I recorded what can be called in sophisticated language semiotic erasure, right? So all the elements that were confusing at first, like the qualifier to, are now gone. And now it's a very clear statement of Jewish exclusionary entitlement to the city. Jaffa is the Jewish city, full stop. And again, here, what we see is a form of engagement, a form of dialogue, which can be also very violent sometimes, but it's never silent, right? It's always on the move. So what we are basically dealing with when we try to understand relations, right? In general social relations, but definitely ethnic and urban relations, is are they separate or how are they linked together? And here we have a very interesting statement by an historian, a social historian called Zachary Lockman, who talks about this, precisely this question, right? He writes, the Arab and Jewish communities in Palestine are represented as primordial, self-contained, and largely monolithic entities. By extension, communal identities are regarded as natural rather than constructed. This approach has rendered their mutually constitutive impact virtually invisible, tended to downplay intra-communal divisions and focused attentions on episodes of violent conflict, all right? So we have here a strong bias, right? That it was sometimes called the dual society paradigm, that we're basically dealing with two enclaves, right? What I will try to do today, and Yoann will exemplify that in a different case, is that we're not talking about enclaves. We're talking about profound relations of interdependence, right? So in sociological terms, we need to go beyond what was called methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism is about our units of analysis. Is our unit of analysis the nation? So you have on the one hand Jews, and on the one hand you have our Palestinians, or perhaps our unit of analysis, our unit of understanding the world is actually the city. And if we see like a city, rather than see like a nation or see like a state, right? And this is the title of a famous book, then we see the world completely different, right? And what I'm trying to do in my own work is to do what I call the ethnography from the street level. So an ethnography that is an engagement with living people, not from the perspective of high theory or the perspective of closed categories, but rather from the perspective of everyday life. Okay, so let's talk about language, right? Coexistence is a huge term that some people reject, some people fantasize about, but even the term mixed town is itself extremely contested, right? And in my historical research, I found out that though it's contested, it's also very much in currency. And I think it's very much in currency precisely because people have no other words to describe this reality, this complicated reality. The beginning of the discourse dates back to the British colonial discourse, right? In 1936, we're talking about the Arab Revolt. The Brits are trying to, on the one hand, deal with the mess, but also to ensure their colonial control over the territory. And what they propose is a separation. This is the first time that territorial separation is proposed in these regions. So Arabs will have their own state and Jews will have their own state. But some cities, said the Brits, are mixed. And therefore, we need to remain, the British government, the British colonial Noor, need to remain in cities that are too complicated to divide. Okay? Then in the 1940s, we see the discourse with Abba Khushi and Haifa and the labor discourse of liberal Zionist autonomism. After the 1948, after the establishment of the state of Israel, the very notion of a mixed city becomes problematic, and the state tries to Hebraize, right, to Judaize the city, to make it part of the Zionist project. And this process lasted for a few decades. Interestingly, in the 1990s, with the revival of a form of civil society, we see that Palestinian civil society is using this concept precisely to talk about a certain form of rights. So we see here a form of the vicissitudes of a discourse that started with the British colonial rule and ended with Palestinian using it as in a critical mode, right? If we look historically, and there is an article I wrote about this long history, this longue durée of mixed Jewish-Arab urbanism in historical Palestine, we see that it goes back to the 16th century, to the pre-national, pre-capitalist Ottoman millet system, and it goes on till the present, right? You can see different forms of cities like Natzrat-Elite forming as a form of a Jewish city, which is now gentrified by middle-class Palestinians. We see cities like Lydda, which had no Jewish population to speak of, but is now a mixed city, etc., etc. We see different forms of urban mixity that can be mapped differently throughout the ages, right? So we see, this is an example of the different cities, right? So Tiberias, for example, was a mixed city in 1948, but it is no more. Look at this graph. So this is a graph that charts the ratio between Arabs and Jews in mixed towns in the last 200 years. What we see clearly is that first, more and more Jews arrive to the region, and this we know. The second thing that we also know is that there is a dramatic moment in 1948 where some cities like Tiberias, right, you can see this line, becomes what some historians call ethnically cleansed. That is, from a majority of the Palestinian population to 0% of the Palestinian population. But look what we see in cases like Jaffa, right? So in Jaffa, immediately after the war, we had only about 4,000 Arabs left in the city, only 5%, right? And you see, I hope you see the mouse, but you see how this demography is changing. And I think this is a very important insight that you can see also in Europe. I have also another project on Jewish revival movements in Europe, and you see, like in Budapest, where I used to teach for many years, the Jewish population changes. So even in places like Germany, even in places like Eastern, like Hungary, where we usually think of the Holocaust as the ultimate event, the ultimate historical event, we see gradual evolution of minority groups. The same happens here. From a moment of catastrophe, we see the growth of a community, which is what we see today. So basically, what is a mixed city? A mixed city is precisely a combination of different logics, of a spatial logic, of a social logic, and of a cultural logic, right? And our role as observers, as anthropologists, is to try to understand the links between space, society, and culture. Okay, so I will talk briefly about the city, about the challenge of living together along these three axes. One is gentrification, the second is mobilization, and the third is alternative culture. Gentrification is interesting in Jaffa, not because so many people want to live next to the sea or want to live with Arabs or away from Arabs, but because it happened due to a very specific moment in urban history, a moment where the periphery became part of the center, right? It is a moment that geographers call the rent gap. When the rent gap emerges, then urban spaces become a hotspot for gentrification, okay? And gentrification, as you know, in Jaffa is extremely charged. This is a slogan from a social movement talking about gentrification as a form of danger. Other people would think of gentrification as a form of investment or as a form of an opportunity, right? So here gentrification is economic transfer. Here we can see the history of gentrification. Gentrification basically is part and parcel of a long urban process, right? On the one hand, after 1948, my family arrived, for example, in 1951 to Menchia. Menchia was completely disinvested, was completely neglected. And in the end, it was completely demolished, right? So this was the story of Jaffa in the first few decades after 1948, right? Urban scholars call it disinvestment, which is an attempt to neglect. It's an intended urban neglect, right? And what happened is that, for example, in Ajami, in the Ajami neighborhood, while in 1960 there were about 20,000 Jews and 4,000 Arabs, in 1980 there were only 5,000 or 6,000 Arabs and only 1,000 Jews, right? So this investment has extreme consequences. Mainly the Jewish community left, as you can see. So this is number 3. The Jewish community left from Ajami and Jabaliyah, from the old city, into Yafo Daled and Yafo Gimel. And this is paradoxically what created the Arab community as a Palestinian community. The Arab community is a political community. Because basically the Arabs were left behind. The planners did not think about the welfare of the Arabs. The projects, for example, that I grew up in Yafo Daled, were meant for Jews, right? So the fact that the Arabs were left behind in many ways had a very interesting effect. The first days or the first weeks or years after 1948 were years of extreme confusion and ambivalence. And this is an example from a tour guide, a guide given to, not tour guide, a guide given to new residents. And it's all about confusion, right? It's all about ambivalence. And it says, so this is a guide written by journalists to the new residents of Jaffa in 1948, 1949, the Bulgarians who came, etc. And they say, the massive immigration brought about the creation of Jaffa, in Jaffa, of a Jewish settlement of 50,000 or more, the largest urban community created by the current ingathering of the exiles. These new old Jewish cities like a sealed book, not only for most Israelis living elsewhere, but also for those living in nearby Jaffa. Jaffa has already become an Israeli city, but not yet a Hebrew city. This is not the normal process of building a town. Here, the empty shell, the houses themselves are ready-made, What was left to be done was to bring this ghost city to life. Materially and externally, Hebrew Jaffa is nothing but the legacy of Arab Jaffa prior to 1948. So this is really a moment of deep confusion, not only for the Palestinian Arabs who were forced to live in a ghetto, but also for the Jews who came, who did not know what to do in the Palestinian houses they invaded or squatted. Okay? And since then, there is a very complicated history of communities, or if you don't want to essentialize communities, about communal formations, right? We have a Palestinian population, we have a veteran Jewish community, we have the new gentrifiers, and now we have even a settler, an urban settler movement, a Torani community. Okay, and for the Palestinians, it's a story of alienation. It's a complicated story also of an attachment to their own city. The city that was called the Arus al-Bahar, Arus Palestine, the bride of Palestine or the bride of the sea, but also al-Gharib. So the mother of the stranger. There's something profoundly cosmopolitan about Palestinian Jaffa, because historically it was a city of labor. It was a port city, like Marseille, a port city of labor. And thus it was used to be to alterities, to differences. And here you see different representations, Palestinian representations of Jaffa. This is the map of the evacuation of houses that Minhal Mikarkei Israel were ordered in 2007. You see here an example of the activism, the housing activism. Interestingly, also in Arabic and Hebrew, right? Taking us back to the question of living together or protesting together. And this graphically says, Jaffa is crying, Yaffa tabki, diyur le'arviyei Yafo, housing for the Arabs of Jaffa. So we see that also in the activism space, it's already a form of a binational space. Okay, this is about gentrification, liknot or lo liot, to buy or not to be, one of the slogans of the gated communities. This is the attack of the mosque in 2001 after the Dolphinarium attack, the suicide bombing in the Dolphinarium, if you remember. And this is an example of how Palestinians portray their own city, right? You see a junkie, a drug junkie, and a scene of crime against the city in flames. So there's a profound sense of anomie, of a loss of social compass. This is Sami Bukhari, a friend and an artist who talks about the city as a form of a graveyard, right? For him, a photographer, the city is like, it's a living dead city, right? And this represents one Palestinian perspective, that the city is a zombie city. It looks alive, but it's actually a dead city, right? And to illustrate this point, he brought this image. So this is an image of a wild boar, a common hobby by Palestinian men in Jaffa to hunt wild boars. But what we see here is a happy boar, which is in fact a dead boar, which is in fact decapitated. And for Bukhari, this is the metaphor, this is the image to capture the double life of the city. Here we see the projects in Yafo Gimel against the new houses in Namal Yafo. Pivko's first house, the house that actually started in Hatzedef Street, the gentrification process, and different examples and maps of gentrification. The urban plan is basically to double the Jewish population. Andromeda gated community is a very interesting place. Here you see a photo I took just before these historic houses were demolished. So you see what we can call a predatory urbanism, that the gated community is not only closed, but it also takes over urban space. The second moment is a moment of action, a moment of urban eros in many ways, a moment of creativity, right? Mobilization, social mobilization in Jaffa, I will focus again back to the story of 2011, where people from Shkunat HaTikva and Jaffa Palestinians came together to struggle and to resist the housing prices, but also raised much larger issues. Here you see the Jaffa Encampment, first starting in July 2011, and the whole process of trying to develop a local language of protest, right? Here you have a Palestinian veiled woman against slogans in Arabic and Hebrew. We demand social housing, the people against the government, and in the background, no true gentrification. And again, you see a Palestinian and a Jewish activist working together for some form of social justice. This is Hatikva, Yafo and Hatikva together. It was a very rare moment where the Mizrahi periphery and the Arab periphery came together. And basically we can develop later that point of what are the relations between center and periphery in Jaffa in comparison to Lydda. Okay, you might remember the March of the Million and the golden calf. The activists in Jaffa created the golden calf, Egel Zahav, to represent the form of capital they protested against. As you know, it was a very dramatic moment, but it was also a moment that dissolved. And in the end of the demonstrations, we were left with the Hamdallah, the famous Palestinian figure of a child, a refugee child, who points his back to the audience. And it says, Ana bi'intidar bayt huwa kaman. I am awaiting a house, and so does he. So there's kind of a correlation between Hamdallah as the icon of the Palestinian struggle and the Jaffa Arabs. Okay, the implication of the local demonstrations in the Arab Springs have been debated. We can talk about its impact on civil society, its impact on different forms of social discourses. The next day, the next year, other things happened. Asma Aghbarieh tried to join the protest, Asma Aghbarieh from Jaffa, but eventually it failed, right? There was an historical moment, there was an historical opportunity, but according to Aghbarieh, this did not go very far, right? And this is what I call situational radicalism. We can talk about it later, what happened then. The people became an empty signifier, right? Because there was a profound disagreement about who is the people, basically the movement did not go very far. The third moment is a moment of joy, of eros, of dancing. We can call it alternative culture. We can call it the popular eros of binationalism. And this is a history that I like to tell because it's an optimistic history, right? It started with a partnership between a Palestinian, Michel, and Dean Ali, a Jewish gentrifier who settled in Jaffa and decided to make a change and to start a bookstore. And it developed further with Honolulu, with a place that turned politics into eros, that turned the other into a form of inspiration, artistic inspiration, but also political inspiration, right? And here we see some of the actors in this club, Eyal Sagi Bijawi and Muhammad Jabali, who were both DJs in this social world. I call it a political hipster because it is a social type that allows you to be cool and hip, but also to be engaged politically, which is something that many people see as a form of contradiction. So basically, alternative culture in Jaffa became the merger of art and politics, but also of consumerism and activism. And let me end here. Let me end with a few poetic moments. The first poetic moment is actually by Levi-Strauss, a French-Jewish anthropologist, who talks about, in one of the mythologies, the myths he recorded, he talks about a conversation between two tribes, two Amerindian tribes. And he calls it la bonne distance, the right distance. And this is the conversation between the elders of these two tribes. And this is, of course, a metaphor for Palestinians and Jews. One tribe says to another, it would be better if you went upstream and built your own village, for our customs are somewhat different from yours. Not knowing each other's ways, the young men might have differences and there would be wars. Do not go too far away, for people who live far apart are like strangers and wars break out between them. So keep the right distance. Travel north only until you cannot see the smoke from our lodges, and there build your village. Then we will be close enough to be friends, but not far enough to be enemies. And in many ways, this is a dilemma. It's also a policy dilemma by planners, but it's also an everyday dilemma by people who live in these cities, right? What is the right distance between myself and the other? Who is the other? Is it the neighbor? Is it just the Palestinian neighbor, etc.? So the city here functions as what Henri Lefebvre called a mediation among mediation. There is a multiplicity of rhythms to the port city. There's a multiplicity of rhythms to the Arab society and the Jewish society. And we bring them together. There is something that we can call a polyrhythmic city. And the question is, how do you deal with this polyrhythmic city? How do you deal with this multitude of urban rhythms, of ways of life? Okay, this is a Hebrew example of the text that I quoted before. So if you read Hebrew, you can look at it and see how beautiful it is to convey this form of ambivalence. And finally, the conceptual question. So what are mixed cities? Are there colonial cities? Are there divided cities? Are there dual cities? What kind of language do we need to talk about them, right? We can think about different forms of being together. Assimilation is one of them. Pluralism is another, but also segmentation and polarization, right? The two modes of social organization that we identify in Jaffa and in Lydda, right? So one question also for us, but also for everyone else, is what kind of language do we develop? What kind of conceptual language do we need to talk about these cities? Poets like Raja Natur expressed it in a very beautiful poetic way, right? In a way that kind of brings together the Palestinian and the Jewish experience. Talk to us, speak up, when we shall look at you on a clear day, and when the eyes will meet, pain will have a fresh edge. How did we resemble ourselves when we left? How did we resemble you when we did not return? How do we resemble all that remains? So there's something, to go back to Edward Said, something deeply troubling, but also connecting between the Jewish diaspora, between the Jewish stories of suffering and the Palestinian story of suffering. And let me conclude with Anton Shammas, one of my favorite authors, who was a Palestinian who was married to a Jewish woman, and he wrote also in Hebrew, right? So there's a multiplicity of transgressions happening here. And he wrote something which is still very troubling, but also very thought-provoking. He says there is no political solution to the problem of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. There is only a cultural solution. The political path to the warm embrace of the Palestinian people was blocked way back because they came in contact with one of the greatest blessings of this accursed century: the ability to see the other from close up, the advantage of bifocal sight, the privilege of bilingualism, the pleasure of trespassing the boundary between the two cultures. And he concludes, the future belongs to mixed marriages. Thank you, and I will stop here and give the table to Yoann.
Okay. Okay, so I will present the case of Yoann Al-Lydd today, that is not as happy or as hype as Jaffa's Daniel Jaffa, because it's very sad story from the beginning of the Israeli story of Yom Ha'atsmaout, with the trauma of the Nakba or Independence War. I will be quite short because Daniel was quite long. About this period, the best book is Elias Khoury's book about the moment after the war, the ghetto of few Palestinian inhabitants remains at the center of what was Lud as a field of rains, actually. And after that, domination started, especially with the toponymy of the old city of Lud, with, as you can see, the South Avenue coming down from the new city center of Lud, going to the old city, and also the Kikar Palma, just along the mosque where the big massacre happened during the war. As I have to say, is Lud, compared to other Palestinian cities, was the most destroyed, as a lot of villages were destroyed, but the most destroyed city was Lud. And we could see a kind of desurbanization or herbicide case in the sense that it had a long citadinity tradition since Talmud to the Ottoman era. And after that, most of Palestinian inhabitants went away or be massacred. And the newcomers were or Palestinian villagers or Olim from also most of them villages like in North Africa. So the urban landscape, especially in the old city and around, is now very concentrated with like shikunim from the 50s and ruins of the Ottoman Palestinian city, as we can see here. And also with opportunity of being at the center, as the exactly center of the country, because Lud is on the way from Jaffa to Jerusalem, and also it's not by random that the airport came here, or it was at the crossroads of the train transportation, as we will see later. And so it's an opportunity for like high-tech firms or banking to have a headquarter here. Also, it's you have airport cities that is depending from Lud, but without being inside the city. So the case of Lud is a case of migrations, not a typical case of migration studies, because you have layers of migration and with new neighborhoods in the cities that are not related from one to each other. The new urban life rapidly not did work. I mean that the city center, the new city center did not become a new center, and the new conflicts happened between the different layers of migrations. I will go, okay. And so you can see like tracks of this history until now. With in the city center, you can see the absorption building. That is because Lud also has a very meaningful very meaningful symbol of Zionism, in the sense of, because it's not far from the airport. Most of migrants, most of Olim came first to the city and then went elsewhere. But it is still a very poor city and with a lot of unemployment, and also well known, especially in the 90s and the beginning of last decade, also as a crime city. So I will skip Yom Ha'atsmaout, even if it's quite interesting, because the difference between Lyd and Jaffa is not a municipality. So Lyd is a municipality that has to organize like this kind of events like Yom Ha'atsmaout. And who is concerned by Yom Ha'atsmaout in Lyd? That's a quite interesting question. Another case study inside the city is St. George pilgrimage, because the city is traditionally considered as to be the city of St. George, GRS, and with a traditional pilgrimage since Ottoman era. And now it's the new this pilgrimage was renewed by the new Christian Israeli, mostly Russians and Ethiopians, but also pilgrims coming from the Balkans, from the Caucasus, at the middle of November every year. So you can see this kind of surrealistic sense with Jewish Christian Israelis, with Palestinians, both of course Christians, but also Arabic, because that's a typical shared pilgrimage between Christian and Muslims. With also like bands coming from Akko, groups of Ethiopians, and also conflicts between, because that's a shared pilgrimage, there is a strong conflict between the mosque that is just along the church and the Christian groups. And Christians are trying to attract like tourists and also different kind of people, but Muslim, and especially the Imam, is more close to this approach. Another interesting case concerning the everyday life at Lyd are the marketplaces, open air market, where both populations, I mean Palestinians, Jews, and migrants that could be or Muslims or Christians mostly, could be all together buying or selling. And it's an interesting space-time of, if not sharing, getting together, talking about prices, comparing commodities, and so on. So this kind of scene, as you could imagine, also it's in Jerusalem, of course, but here the situation is quite different of Jerusalem, in the sense of it's not the tension is not as high as in Jerusalem, and people are here just being all together because of low prices mostly. So to complete the presentation of Daniel, and to also going on with non-national approach, we can see three kinds of normativity on urban space-time. One is horizontality that we could see in open air market, and living or more getting together, like an occasion, and I have the same kind of approach than Daniel, like grassroots level, street level, everyday life ethnography. A specific case of Lydda is also the cooperation in criminality between drug sellers, informal banking, and customers that could be or Muslim, Christian, or Jews. It doesn't care. That's the united colors of crime. And the other important factor is still the will of the state or institution, national institutions to keep a verticality, a top-down approach on this kind of mixed cities. And that you could see with the new municipal building that is very huge compared to the need of the city, and that is inside the old city and trying to express the domination of the municipality, and behind the municipality is the state on this part of the city that is mixed between mostly Muslims, but now also or poor Jews or newcomers that are from the same group that Daniel described, Garinim, Toranim. Another important new building at Lydda is a new railway station that is again quite huge and trying to remap the city center around it and to make again Lydda the center of the country. With that, we have still the patchwork of communities with like a new group also constituted by student associations, because Lydda is not far from by train from Ben Gurion University or Tel Aviv University, and the flats are very cheap compared to, I don't know, to Petah Tikva or to even Beersheba. So they try to represent the city as a city of patchwork of communities. And the reality is a different kind of use that a friend of mine, a photograph from Switzerland, came a few years ago, did represent with or Bedouins, Mizrahi, Ethiopians, Moroccans, Ashkenaz, or that would like to try to begin a new political career, director of Bedouin school, an old Moroccan fond of Mizrahi music, Bedouins, Georgians, Gruzinim, religious Gruzinim, or Ethiopians. And to conclude, I hope not being too late, I would like to go back to the theme of the French Institute, that is what is being proche or close to or nearby or be along. What is that? What is the learning of mixed cities, of being together, living together, getting together? So as Daniel told, that kind of cities are laboratories of the ambivalence of what is shared, the question of recognition, what is the coexistence. Different behavior could be observed, like idealism, pragmatism, but at the end, most of the group try to be in exclusive inclusion, like being like inside themselves and excluding others, but doing that, they consider the other as someone inside the whole game. So now I will be happy to answer questions. with Daniel.
Perhaps we can start. There is one question from Yoann Morvan about confederalism. And I think this is an opportunity to think about mixed cities, not only in terms of tragedy, the way many people think about them, but also as an opportunity, right? As Yoann said, a form of political laboratory. And let me invite you to think about mixed cities as a very variable model for the future, right? If we can imagine a future that assumes not separation, but what the French call mixité, a form of urban mix as its assumption, right? If we think about our region in this perspective, then basically cities like Haifa and Jaffa and Lydda and Acre, but also to some extent also Carmiel, Beersheba, and even Nacat can be models, experimental models for future solutions. That is, if Haifa is what I call the center of the periphery, which is why we have middle-class bourgeois Palestinians coming from the Galilee, settling in Haifa to establish a Palestinian modern city, an urban space where one of the few urban spaces in Israel where they can actually live their lives in Arabic. Jaffa is, as I said, the periphery of the center. So we have here different models of power relations between Arabs and Jews, between the citizens and the municipality, between the municipality and the state, which for me are extremely interesting. Why are they interesting? Because it is a place that is organic, that is naturally occurring, as opposed to Neve Shalom, right? If you know, Neve Shalom is one of these experimental communities where Palestinians and Jews decided to come together to live in Jaffa, to live in a settlement, in a community. My family did not decide to live with Arabs or without Arabs. They just happened to end up in Manshiyeh and in Yafo Daled, etc. And I ended up in the French, as a Jew in the French Catholic school, right? These are not strategic maneuvers. And for me, because this is not an ideological environment, but a naturally occurring environment, it can lead the way to some policy thinking, to some ways of already imagining a future beyond the specific territorial struggles that we are trapped in.
So we have both questions on Q&A and in the chat too. So one question and Q&A is about patterns in terms of political vote in mixed cities in Israel. Concerning Lud, the patterns are mostly on the long term with Likud, and first led by Ashkenazi Likudnikim, and then by Likudnikim from Moroccan origins. And now, from the few last years, the Abayit Yehudi became a local powerful group too, mostly because from people from the Garinim Toranim came to live inside the city. Another question on Q&A is, you were making a comparison between Marseille and Jaffa. Could you please say more about it? I can say something about Marseille and Lud, because it's not only Jaffa could be compared with Marseille. also the political governance, I mean, in terms of clientelism, is very strong both in Lydda and in Marseille, that are both very corrupted municipalities with a lot of, I don't know how to say it, like drug criminalities, but in another sense, the daily life, both in Lydda and in Marseille, is very quiet compared to like Paris or Jerusalem or what else. So perhaps Daniel could say something more about.
I think it's a fascinating question, because it takes us out of the ghetto of our thinking. Most Israelis and Palestinians think that we are very special, that we are exceptional, that we are trapped in a very unique conflict. But what I would like to argue is that we're actually part of a much larger history, right? The longue durée, the long-term history of Mediterranean cities. And if we think about Jaffa, and to some extent about Lydda, as part of a historical network that connected Beirut, Alexandria, Marseille, and other cities, then we see that some of the, I don't know if you ever been to Jaffa and you found that the tiles of the houses are actually from Marseille, and it's written on them. The historical architecture that some people think about it as Arab houses is actually more related to Marseille than to anything else, right? It's related to a different style of life, to a different aesthetic sensibilities that was dominant in the interwar era, right? So what we have here is also a political potential to revive this connectivity across the Mediterranean space. And this is something that is not just a figment of my imagination, but it is also a political and an artistic project, but by many young activists who are trying to make the connections between Jaffa and Beirut, for example, or between Jaffa and Alexandria. And Marseille is interesting because if you travel between these Mediterranean cities, you have a sense that you've been there already before, right? There's something about the rhythm of the city. There's something about the way interact with the sea. There's something about the way people interact with the other that is structurally similar, not identical, but similar. In the sense that Marseille is also a plural city, right? It is of course less political. And both Jaffa and Marseille have this sense of distance between the city and the state. So in many ways, it's the city against the state. In France, they say that Marseille is un pays à part, a city, like a country of its own, right? As if the connection to North Africa makes it something different. And the same can be said about Jaffa, the history of the ambivalent relations between Jaffa and Jerusalem, which is parallel to the ambivalent relations between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, right? The holy city, the political city, and the capitalist city, the modernist city, right? These processes can be read against each other. And I think it also allows us to relativize our state of our predicament and think about the future, think about ourselves, not as isolated monads, but also as part of a much broader history. Perhaps it's also an opportunity, Yoann, to talk about what we argue about verticality and horizontality.
Yeah, we could go back with that because both Lydda and Marseille, the vertical approach is failing. I mean, both the state or a fortiori the municipalities of Marseille or the municipality of Lydda are almost in a bankruptcy state. So, but in another sense, these cities are quite rich. People are working, are dealing with even illegal money, or with illegal trades, and people are living all together daily, basically.
There's also something about verticality that is extremely interesting in cities like Lod and Jaffa, because verticality, or what I call the logic of mediation, the connection between the citizen, the community, the city, and the nation, is something that is very difficult to accomplish in these cities. Not only because they are mixed, but also because the political community is relatively very fragile and very weak, right? So we have on the one hand the
segmented too, and segmented, and that's why, for example, I skipped the 2 slides on Yom Ha'atsmaout at Lod, but Yom Ha'atsmaout is a typical vertical event in this kind of city.
I think, yeah, I mean, what Yoann says is very interesting, because you have crucial or critical events like Yom Kippur, right? Where Jews do not drive, they fast, they stay at home, they go to, they go on bicycles, have to interact in urban space with Christians and Muslims who, for them, Yom Kippur is a vacation, right? So they go to public space, they occupy public space, they barbecue, sometimes they take, the motorcycles, of course they join the bicycle festivity, but it creates a very interesting moment of forced engagement that people have to explain to each other why are they doing what they're doing. The same goes for Ramadan, right? Muslims are negotiating. You can see that every Ramadan, every Yom Kippur, over Facebook, people are arguing, right? And this form of argument, I think, is a very healthy process, because people are forced to reckon, to deal with the otherness of the other, right? And this negotiation is something that is on the pragmatic and on horizontal level. So this is basically the constitutive tension in ethnically mixed cities, right? If you think about al-Fahm, or if you think about Tel Aviv or Bat Yam, they don't have to deal with these complexities, right? Because usually the color, race, even class is often relatively well defined. What we have in this group of cities, you can call it targeted cities, you can call it marginalized cities, you can call it binational cities, or you can call it ethnically mixed cities. You have this potentially divisive vector, but also an element that forces you to deal with the other. And I think this is, for me, also as a political agenda, this is a perspective of optimism, because a solution to the conflict would not come just from a top-down negotiation between politicians, but mainly from a bottom-up realization that the other, whether it is the Jew or the Palestinian, is here to stay.
And that's another point of comparison with Marseille. In the sense is what is different between Marseille, for example, and Aix-en-Provence, or between Jaffa and Tel Aviv, or Lod and Jerusalem, is in Jaffa, Marseille, or Lod, most people are racist, but in Aix-en-Provence, Tel Aviv, or Jerusalem are more racial cities.
Yeah. You want to develop this? Is a very important. What's the difference between being racist and being racist?
Being racist is considering the other as being in the game, being in the place. But racial cities, in racial cities, the other is not even here. Yeah. The other is fully excluded.
Yeah. There are a few questions here by Jan Landau and Anne-Marie. About whether other cities, what do we consider like mixed cities? And this is something which is fascinating in urban studies, because many people hate the concept of mixed cities, which is why I try to historicize it. But there is this is the concept that most people use. right? So there is kind of a gap between the normative position of researchers who say that these cities are not really mixed, because they are, and they are very unequal in terms of resources, in terms of ownership, in terms of property regime. So why do we call them mixed cities? Well, this is a public discourse, right? This is a public discourse that many people, that is mostly used. So we have to address it. And I think the paradox, which we don't see in Marseille, because Marseille, I think, embraces this mixity. But cities like Jaffa and Haifa and Lydda, many people, especially if they are politically aware, reject the very mixity of their city. So there is another form of ambivalence by people who live in these cities and share public space and urban space with the other, but still reject the very notion of mixity, because mixity itself is a contaminated concept. And this is something that I believe is unique to us, to this context.
Other questions, perhaps?
Anne-Marie is also asking about Tiberias, which I think is a tragic case. Tiberias, historically, was a place where Sephardic Jews were indigenous. They were part and parcel of the Arab community. They were Arab Jews in the strictest sense, right? They were living there for generations. They spoke Arabic. They had commercial and social interactions with their neighbors. But in 1948, this city, which was part also of this colonial British category of mixed cities, the cities was completely emptied out of its Palestinian component. So I think it's a lesson for us to see, and we can see that also in the Balkans. What happens, the fact that a city has a history of urban mix, or even a history of shared conviviality, and sometimes, you know, in Sarajevo, people intermarried. This did not prevent political violence to take place. So I think we have a huge challenge ahead of us, a challenge to deal with questions of recognition, right, reconnaissance, but also a challenge of ensuring equal citizenship to all the mixed cities citizens. And this is something that most mayors of Lyd and Ramle and Carmiel recently are not able to deal with, right? Famously, the mayor of Ramle said a few years ago, why should we give Arab residents street names, Arabic street names, right? If they want an Arabic city, let them go to Del Julia. This is a quote from the Ramle mayor a few years ago, right? So this also demands a form of political will, right? But political will, I would argue, it does not suffice. Political will have to come also with some form of a civil society, some form of grassroots organization.
There are other questions? Yes, Akko is a mixed city too, for Patrice Servanti. And Yossi Shavit is asking, the compositions of both Arab and non-Arab communities in these cities are changing over time. That's true. For example, in Jaffa, the share of upper class Jews is growing, whereas among Arabs, many weaker families are living, indeed to Al-Lydd. And how do these changes affect inter-community relations? Daniel?
Yeah, basically, Yossi, you're taking us, so there are different ratios, of course. There are different demographic ratios of between Jews and Arabs in ethnically mixed cities. They vary from 30% to 10%. If you consider Tel Aviv and Jaffa one space, which is also a political but also a sociological decision, then we're talking only about 4% or 5%. But if you consider Jaffa as what in the municipality called the district number 7, then we're talking about 30%. While 30% is already a major presence in the city. The process of gentrification, namely the process of transforming a low status, low income inner city into a middle class bourgeois neighborhood, is rocking the boat, right? And I don't know, sometimes this expresses itself not only in terms of housing, which is the crucial existential question for the Arab minority, because Palestinians in Jaffa largely do not own their houses. And this is the case in most ethnically mixed cities. They are on what we call long-term lease. Okay, so basically they rent, it's called protected lease sometimes. They rent for 2 generations their apartments from the state, mediated by Amidar and Khalamish, and this puts them in a very fragile position, which manifested itself in 2007 when the Minhal decided to evacuate around 400 families living in Ajami and Jabaliyah. So precisely the hotspot of gentrification is the place that we saw this kind of enforcement. And of course, immediately after, these houses were sold on the free market, right? So we have extremely politicized processes of ownership and property regime. But just to give you an interesting anecdote, gentrification is not just about housing. It's also about the cultural profile of the city. So recently there were debates about whether gay couples, so there was an incident a year ago about a gay couple in the Jaffa port who was harassed and attacked. And there was a huge debate of whether it is part of the culture of a city for gay couples to show public affection. The second case is the case of the rooster. So just like in the south of France, there was a famous story of, is it Maurice? What's the name of the famous rooster? There was a rooster, a chicken, who became a symbol of the urbanites coming into the village. And in Jaffa recently, there is a similar debate about roosters, right? Whether the singing or the noise that roosters make every day is a legitimate part of the cityscapes. And you can see people divided, not necessarily along ethnic lines. Yeah, you can see some of the veteran Jews supporting the presence of roosters and other animals like horses in the city, because for them it's part of the authentic identity of the city. And you see newcomers, gentrifiers mostly, who are objecting it because they want a clean space. They want a bourgeois space. They want a space that is controllable.
Yeah, the case is quite different in Lydda, but in Lydda also the newcomers are not very well appreciated by the inhabitants. I mean, both students, yes, students are quite well appreciated by the Ludnikim, but the Datim Leumim, the people from Garinim Toranim or new Muslim people coming from Yafo, they are not both very well considered by the local people. There are other questions about the age of Yafo, Haifa. They say Marseille is only 2060 years old. That's quite a lot.
Does it matter if it's 2,000 or 4,000 or 5,000?
Another question is about another question was about the one-state solution.
Right.
If this kind of city could be or not an example of what could be a one-state solution. And another question is about what is the composition of municipal council in mixed cities? Are there Arab citizens represented in the municipal councils? Can they influence the decision in terms of planning housing, for example? Concerning planning housing, we are, of course, going back to what we told about horizontality and verticality, because, of course, question of planning houses or housing are typical top-down decisions. So the margins are not very involved in that. And in, about the composition of municipal council, of course, the Arab citizens are not as represented as other groups, but they are not ghost citizens in a sense. They have like rights, and but they are like subaltern citizens. Perhaps Daniel, Daniel could say something about perhaps, I don't know, Akko or other mixed cities, because Jaffa is not a municipality. So,
well, in Jaffa we have two Palestinian members of the city council. One of them, Amir Badran, was my classmate back in the Collège des Frères, and the other, Abed Abu Shhade, younger, and a representative of a new generation, which is also something that I'm very happy to see. We have the rise, the emergence of a new Palestinian generation, highly educated, extremely active and extremely vocal, who are not shy anymore to make political claims, but also to acknowledge the involvement, for example, of Arabs in the gentrification process, right? So there is because some of the investors, some of the dealers, some of the agents are themselves Arab Palestinians, right? So this is also a moment, you know, we can talk about the underworld, the crime world, which is also a mixed world, but also the capitalist world is mixed in many ways. And for the Palestinian generation to say, we are not just victims, but we are also a part and parcel of the different processes in the city, I think is a major step forward, because the new generation is not silenced. The new generation of Palestinian activists, I think, is more and more vocal and more influential in this regard. My second point is about the connection between Lydda and Jaffa. And it is true that the skyrocketing housing, real estate prices in Jaffa are pushing Arabs who cannot afford it to Lydda and Ramleh. But paradoxically, this is also because the division between Jaffa and Lydda and Ramleh is in many ways artificial. Between 1948, this was one space, right? Qada, Jaffa, the Jaffa district was a space that included many villages. It included over 100,000 inhabitants. So in many ways, we can see now that the new links or the old new links between different cities that were separated for many years. And this is true that we are facing a very serious crisis. And I can just give you an example of a family I'm close to, and the mother lived in a beautiful house with her 3 children in Ajami, and she was forced to sell it. She didn't own it, but she was on this protected lease on Dmei Mafteach, and she was forced to sell it to Amidar, and she received 60%, and she used this 60% to buy houses in Ramleh for her children, right? So we are talking about a form, gentrification is not just a form of the reorganization of the class system of the city, but it's also a form of displacement.
Yeah, Patrice is talking about, of course, Haifa, and Haifa is the best model of mixed cities, actually. Because there is also a question from Jan Landau about young couple in the chat, about young couples prefer living in mixed cities, especially in the Haifa case, that is a kind of cultural capital for all the Palestinians from the north of the country. The Haifa, yeah, is very attractive for the young couples, and also for it's an interesting case compared to the center of the country web of cities between Jaffa and subaltern Ramle-Lud that are connected, of course. But Haifa, that's another geographical web between Haifa and villages and small Palestinian towns in the Galil. And for sure, Haifa has to be also mentioned as an interesting case. Okay.
Yeah, one aspect that I think is crucial to understanding the phenomenon of this binational urbanism in Israel is the language of normal, right? So we often ask ourselves, so what is normal, right? What is normalcy? And usually the answer is Haifa. Haifa became, for many specific reasons, we can talk about the symbol of so-called normalcy, right? But if you ask any Palestinian in Haifa, you would get the answer that no, Haifa is as abnormal as Jaffa, perhaps even more, because of this illusion, right? So life in mixed cities is really about dealing with these questions of normalcy. Sometimes they are likened, sometimes they are compared to Belfast, right? Where the question of normalcy became most acute, right? And here we have, on the one hand, an illusion of normalcy sometimes, but on the other, we have moments of eruption, right? Like in 2000, the October events, and like in Jaffa, after every case of police killing or harassment or surveillance, we realize that even normalcy is a form of illusion.
Martial would like to.
No, I was going to say that if there is no more question, I would suggest to finish here. It's been more than an hour and a half. Yoann, Daniel, thank you very much for being with us and answering all the questions and your presentations. Thank you very much to all the attendees to be there tonight. You were a lot that we are really appreciate. And for your information all, after this conference in June, we will have like an event at the French Institute, like an exposition in the conference hall from Yoann, who will like present his work on Lydda. So stay in touch with the French Institute and you will get all the information for this next event to come. Thank you very much once again.
Yeah, thank you, and very welcome for the exhibition in June. Hope to see you, I mean, face to face there at that time.
Yeah, because we will have this exhibition, but you will also come, Yoann, I think, and organize like a tour, or at least comment your work with some people who could be interested. So that could be an opportunity to gather in the French Institute, indeed.
And we have like, okay. We have like few questions again. One is from Patrice Cervanti about the Druze. And another one is about if the conference is available online. Martial?
The conference will be available online. It's recorded right now. And we will put it on the the French Institute YouTube channel, and we will send a link to all the people who register to this conference. So you will all get the link for sure.
And
thank you very much for starting this important discussion. Thank
you very much. And last question you want to answer to Patrice, Yoann?
I'm not specialist of the Druze, but I think Druze, they have their own way of having relations with other different groups. So I'm not sure that they are facilitating the connection between other Arabs and Jewish community in northern Israel. They are a piece of the complex game of the northern part of the country, but if they are facilitating, I mean, by their presence perhaps, but directly, I'm not sure. Daniel, what do you think about it?
I suggest that if people have any more questions, feel free to contact us individually. You can find our emails, and we'll be delighted to continue the conversation in private.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Patrice, also for being here, our consul in Haifa. And have a good night all. Thank you very much once again, Yoann and Daniel. See you.
Good evening.